I'm Lucy Duncan. I'm the Director of Friends Relations for the American Friends Service Committee. And AFSC for several years has been promoting and teaching Quaker social change ministry as a tool for collective, spirit-grounded social justice work, where you practice creating beloved community with people and really sort of learning accountability for each other and care and sort of living into a different sort of way of being. And then the way that the social change work is done is foundationally as accompaniment. So working to follow the leadership of those most impacted by injustice, to show up materially, to shift the conditions of people of color that are feeling the impacts of targeting, and to really show up in a way that honors them and shifts their conditions in foundational and powerful material ways, and to do that by shifting relationships. That's foundationally what we're doing. So this last week we talked about the spiritual practices. That all was put on. Excuse me. That was all recorded, and it is up online on the Quaker Social Change Ministry page. You should have gotten that in the um, email that was sent to you. And this week we're really going to focus on the practice of accompaniment. This is really an introduction to the practice of accompaniment, which I think of as a profoundly powerful tool for doing social change work, but also for being spiritually present to another, but also for really transforming your relationship with people who are impacted by injustice, and transforming your internal relationship with other people that are accompanying them as well. And I found it to be really powerful. So this one will focus a lot on that. We'll do some exercises. This is really an introduction, and AFSC last year experimented with a longer term webinar e-course called Changing Systems, Changing Ourselves, Anti-Racist Praxis for Sanctuary Resistance and Accompaniment. And that we really dove much more deeply into accompaniment. We're going to be doing that, a different version of that series with 5 webinars, e-course, beginning in January. So this will be sort of a top-level introduction to that, and if you want a deeper dive, we'll have this opportunity in January, in which we're asking people to join as part of a group and to study together and do homework together, and really and then hold one another together as you experiment with the praxis. So we're going to be using a couple of these things: the chat, raising hands, and speaking and turning your camera on if I call on you. So I look forward to that. And our last session was really interactive, and we had, I thought, what was some significant conversation with one another, and I think we want to do that again this time, and there'll be lots of opportunities for us to engage in that way. I'm a really strong believer that that learning happens when you interact and try to engage with ideas and with the concepts and with principles and practices, and that so we try and set up these webinars so that you can do that as much as possible in this kind of format. All right, so excuse my cat again. So ultimately, so sometimes people think about a companionship or accompaniment as not as passive and not active. And it's really important that people understand that it's incredibly active. It's just that you're centering the voices that you most want to be that are most impacted, and that should also be in leadership in the struggles for their own liberation. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge how important action is in this process, and being willing to take risks, and being willing to to lean in and really do this. And this quote, this is often attributed to Lila Watson, who is an Aboriginal activist in New Zealand, but she's very clear that this is not her statement alone, that it was a collective statement about how to be in solidarity with one another. And so what she says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that at the root of this accompaniment practice is the understanding that we're really trying to disrupt systems of oppression, and that these systems of oppression dehumanize us all in different ways. If we're socially located with more privilege, the way that the system um, um, the system numbs us, teaches us to not pay attention to other people, to feel disconnected foundationally, and that our liberation out of that state, out of having our bodies sort of used in the as oppressors in a system, is this deep solidarity with one another. And it's really important to acknowledge that accompaniment, people sometimes they don't like the word because they're like, well, wait a minute, I have all this stuff to bring, and I'm an expert, and I have, and 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 the process of accompaniment is really a process of humility, to move one to shift one's relationship with the people who are oppressed, moving us to what some people call co-resistors or co-conspirators, which I really love because that means you're breathing together. That's what that means. So that you understand the way that you're impacted by the system, and you want your liberation as well, and that through the process of working for and on behalf of and at the leadership of those people that are most oppressed, you are also being free. You are also finding a sense of belonging. You are also shifting the way that your body has been implicated in the system. So this is a really important concept that's embedded in this. And the thing is that in my experience of the practice, you really can't skip steps. That in order to become a co-conspirator, you really have to do a real intentional practice of learning to center the voices of those most impacted, to really learn fellowship, because these things are not, they're not socially, they're not how we're normally or in normative in our society to learn this practice. So that's what I'm going to start with. So we're going to dive in right now into I'd like you can raise your hand, or you can use the chat. I'll watch the chat, and we're gonna really talk about what does accompaniment mean, and what does companionship mean, and what does followership mean. And they're very similar, but they have a subtle differences between them. So so I love the conversation that we had last time, and I would love it if folks would raise their hands, um, you can, if you're on the phone, you can unmute yourself, or if you'd like to just put something in the chat, that works well as well. So when you think of the concept of accompaniment, what comes to mind? What rises in your mind? What do you think of? And again, like, feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to put something in the chat. And if you're on the phone, you can just unmute yourself. What do you think of when you think of accompaniment? What rises, and what do you think accompaniment means, what it's about? Rebecca said she thinks of it first in a musical sense. That I think is it's a really important one. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the last session, when you're supporting another person's a soloist or another musician's voice or performance, you're conscious of really being in the background and supporting that, but not foregrounding their voices, not overtaking them, and so it's really about supporting their voice, and I think that one's a really important one. Bob said, to hear and see the other person and be heard and seen by them. Yeah. Um, yeah, that presence, and the practice of presence is really an elemental part of this. Rebecca says the company supports and follows and lifts up but never obscures. That's really, really wonderful language in terms of when musical accompaniment or accompaniment in this practice as well. And feel free, you all, to raise your hand and speak up too. I love to hear your voices as well. Um, let's see, we have going along with someone who is struggling. Yeah, really, really important. And I think that going along with somebody who's struggling and being willing to be on their journey with them, I think that's a really important piece of this. Sarah Keeney says being vigilant together. Yeah, that's really critical in order to feel as though people are being supported, that you're paying attention to the risks that are all around, and that being really vigilant about the work you do together. Kristen says, I think about using my privilege to support the cause of those most impacted. Yeah, and I think this one is one that one needs to be really conscious about when you're utilizing your privilege to dismantle your privilege, because you have to be really careful that you're not centering the privilege, but rather using the access that you might have, or using the spaces that you might have access to, or using the platforms that you have in order to create more space for justice. But I think that that's recognizing your social location and what kind of access that might give to you, I think is really, really important as well. Rob says walking with another. Yeah, I mean, it's very, in its elemental form, it's very simple. It's about really being present, walking side by side with somebody, not like following their lead and the footsteps that they take, not getting ahead of them, and being present in and really attuned with them, attuned in a way that you can follow what they need and what they want. I would love to hear your voices if you all want to talk. I don't need to hear my voice so much. So anybody want to raise your hand or just, say what you think? That would be really great, because I think you all have a lot to say. Just say who you are if you want to do that. Any other thoughts about this?
I'm Carl Magruder, and my work was doing it today is as a end-of-life palliative care and hospice chaplain. And so I accompany people in their dying process. And that doesn't mean that I'm dying. So there's an aspect of accompaniment that doesn't mean you're exactly on the same journey. And then the other thing is that there's the experience is really ruined if I think I know the destination or the right way for them to do this, or when it's going to happen, or any of that. So part of accompaniment is really being present to not knowing.
That's really important. Yes, that is so critical. Did you say being open to not knowing, Carl?
No, it's more like the Buddhist practice of child's mind or no mind. I mean, lung cancer metastatic to the bone. I think I know how this is going to go. But it's kind of like the Quaker prohibition against creeds. It's not that the creed is in error. It's that a creed is an error, because you're not listening then. You think you know more. You think you know. And so, I don't know. I don't want to
But you used a really good phrase. I just want to get it accurately down about not knowing.
Yeah, intentional not knowing or conscious.
Intentional not knowing. That's great. And what I would say is embracing uncertainty as part of the path. I think that's really critical. Anybody else? Oh, Jean. Hi, Jean. Nice to see you here.
About how to get in. I visit people in prison, and we also have people who are in the work release program on their way out of prison who are in our meeting, our friends meeting for worship Sunday morning. And so I have a sense of accompaniment, of being with them, and it's really neat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you want to unraise your hand, you just click it again, that same thing. Anybody else want to add to this one? All right, great. Thank you. I mean, I think it's really about um, uh, this deep presence, and I think that the intentional not knowing, embracing uncertainty is really, really key. Um, and and trusting the person that you're accompanying, trusting them in an elemental way, to know what it is they need, and to be willing to follow them in their journey. And I think that also what Carl said about that, obviously he's not going to know exactly what a dying person experiences. I think there's this other piece where there's humility about not ever really being able to know what it means to be targeted by the particular oppression of the person that we're following, whether that's somebody targeted in the immigration system or in the prison system or in Palestine. You're not going to know. And so there's this kind of trusting of the person being accompanied, that to be the expert, to know what it is they need. And I think that that's a really elemental and important aspect of it. Mika says, being in a relationship without needing anything in particular to happen. That is really important. That is so important, because it's important that that we often are like getting in a hurry, like, I'm here to do something, I'm here to make something happen. And 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 what this practice teaches you is that presence is very deep, and it will lead you to action. It's not passive, but that it's it it requires the presence, and the person to trust that you will be present for you to be called to action. And that is a very different thing from, I have a leading, I'm going to go do it. It's this person, I'm with them, and they're guiding me where we need to go. Great, thank you. So we're going to go on to companionship. Obviously, they're similar, but they're somewhat different. And I would love for anybody to say what comes up for them when they think of companionship. And again, you can just unmute yourself, chime in, put something in the chat. It is a little different in this case, so I'd love to hear what you all have to say. No? All right, well, let's let people think about it for a minute. But when something comes to you. Minga, you have something you want to share? I think you might be talking and you're very squeaky and we can't understand. It looks like you're unmuted. Yeah, it looks like you're talking, but so Lem, if you can help Minga so that we can hear her. And if you're willing, Minga, if you want to put it in the chat for now, I'd love to hear your voice, but if Lem can try and help you. So Kristen says more of a relationship of equals. That I think is a really important, like, it's a little shift in between accompaniment and that. I think it's really interesting because it's still equals, but there's in accompaniment, there's more explicit um, consciousness of social location. I think in companionship there is as well, but I think that there's more of a sense of we're together. I am your companion, you're my companion, and of walking side by side. That's really helpful. Other folks. Journeying together, Mika. Yes, it's definitely journeying together, um, and um, and being and journeying together in such a way that the accompanier is willing to take the risks of the accompanied. I think on the last thing, I think I mentioned going to Palestine and being in the village of Susia, and the way that that the ecumenical accompaniers walk with the children, walk the children to school, and there's a settlement up on the hill, and settlers are often enacting violence on this village of herder people, and that the companiers come and they walk the children to school. They sometimes get beaten up by the settlers, and and what they're asked to do is tell people about their experiences as well as just be present. So you're journeying together, and you might experience some piece of what the person accompanied feels. There's on the Changing Systems, Changing Themselves, there was a really wonderful story, I mean, that was heartbreaking, about some immigrant companions showing up for uh, an ice meeting, and the people they were companioning being taken in and into custody and deported, and so there was this like visceral experience of that, and they needed to find a way to be present, despite the fact that they were feeling some of what the family was feeling. Anita says, forming a symmetrical community. Can you say more about that? I'd love to hear more. Go ahead and unmute yourself and say more about that, or type more, whatever you want. That's interesting to me. I'd love to hear more about it. If you want to share, Anita. Okay.
Anita, and everyone, just a quick reminder, if you move your cursor, if you're on the screen and you move, if you're on a computer, if you move your cursor, you'll see controls at the very bottom, and on the very left, there's a mute icon. I mean, a mic, yeah, mute and a mic icon, and you can click that to unmute yourself, and then click it again to mute yourself when you're done speaking.
All right, great. Anybody else have something that they'd like to share about this, about companionship in particular? One of the things, we'll talk about this, and it's in the definition, but companionship comes from the etymology is to share bread. Com is together, face to face. So that's basically what. And so there's something about the sharing of bread, the sharing of experience, the sharing of time together. But this face-to-faceness, I think, is a really important piece, that you're looking each other in the eye, that you're really present, and as has been said, you're forming a relationship of equals, that Kristen said. So I think the sharing of bread together, face-to-face. Go ahead.
I appreciate that you said that. The companioning thing I was thinking of was something I saw in the Catholic Worker in Las Vegas years ago. And the food that was donated was the kind of food that, as a educated middle class person, I scorn. Aunt Jemima syrup, canned fruit, cocktail, commercial white bread pancakes. And the people who live there come from a similar background of mine, but they ate the food that they were feeding the people as a matter of, well, actually for them, I think it was a matter of they didn't think about it. But when I asked about it, it was like, why would I be entitled to
Mm.
something else or something better? And for some reason, that was much more challenging to me than even, you know, doing No Mas Muertes in the Arizona desert. This thing of like, it was like a real sacrifice that was harder to harder.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's neat that it's
Uh,
about sharing bread. And
uh-huh,
I
uh-huh.
worked in a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C., and all of the noblesse oblige folks like me would feed the people the greasy sausages or whatever that had been, you know, the expiration date at Safeway. And then we went around the corner to the classy coffee place and had burritos,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm, mm,
No, that's not companioning.
yeah. That's really great. Like eating the same food, the same food together. That's really wonderful. Mingus says, in Quaker tradition, an elder accompanies a minister. In companionship, both people may have a joint ministry. Right. And I think that there's, I think that that, and the ministry like of companionship is very distinct in the eldership tradition of like I was at Intermountain Yearly Meeting several years ago doing a spiritual storytelling workshop and was the like main resource people at Intermountain, and Angelina Conti was my elder, younger than me, which I think was, she was an amazing elder. And what I saw her do for me was she watched my energy. She was standing next to me during the whole time. She noticed if I needed a break from like being in contact with everybody else. She also would give insight into like the kind of thing I was saying, or I could check in with her about you know, how she could watch the impact of my words and what I was doing on other people and give me some feedback. And so there's all this stuff that she was paying attention to that I as the facilitator of the process didn't have the capacity to. So I think that's a really good tradition to draw upon. So, and eldership and companionship. Anything else that people want to say about companionship before we move on? All right. So followership. This is a little different. So what rises for you in the image of followership? What's the distinct like thing that you think of when you think of followership? And raise your hand or just turn on your camera, just talk or unmute yourself. Go ahead. I heard somebody say something. Learning from the other. Yeah. Yeah. There's a real learning from the other that happens when you're standing next to somebody and you're really thinking about them. One of the things that was really interesting, I did a workshop on Quaker Social Change Ministry at Southeastern Yearly Meeting in the spring. There was a big group of 42 people. And there was an African American man there who said that when he thinks of followership, he thinks it's really negative, that we're supposed to lead, that leadership is held up as what we're supposed to do. And I thought that was really important, like just to put out there and be in the space. We are taught that leadership is what we're supposed to do. We're taught in terms of if we're more privileged that that's what we're supposed to do. And so there's this kind of like diminishment of what being a follower is. And I think that that's a really important thing to just notice. And I think about followership is also something where you're following somebody else gives them legitimacy. So I think about Trump, and I think about, for example, and that if he didn't have any followers, he wouldn't have the power that he has. And so when you're following somebody who has been targeted by oppression, you're sharing their power with them. When you're offering your humility and your ability to set aside your agenda and follow theirs, it's not empowerment, but you're lending your energy and your commitment to what they are trying to do, and that can be a really, really powerful thing. And who we follow matters, and how we follow them. I also think uh, I'll leave space for anybody else, but I think a lot about discipleship, that this is really about discipleship and putting ourselves in a position to be the disciple of somebody who has, sorry, I misspelled that, who has less privilege. Minga asks, how is followership different from following the divine voice? So this is an excellent question, because in anything that any of us do, we need to be listening to our gut, listening to our instincts, making sure that what we're doing lines up with our sense of our best selves. But I think that the other piece about followership is that some of the stuff that is instinctual, for me, some of the stuff that's instinctual to me comes from my socialization and is not about following the divine voice. It's really not. And so there's a really important process of distinguishing between that. And I think that following the leadership of people that are impacted by injustice, I mean, of course we're discerning in like choosing who we're following, but I think that that process, for me, it really is elementally about following the spark of the divine in another person, and recognizing that, and in some ways putting myself in service of that. Martha says there are times when we might not agree with what those we are accompanying decide, but not knowing all the facts, we acquiesce. We might not even challenge until we know more. That's really true. And I think this is a real process of like listening to oneself, but listening to somebody else. I mean, I have experiences in intimate connections with people of color, or people that are socially located very different from me, and I might not get something, but over time, as I listen to them and follow their leadership and listen to their discernment and understanding, I shift how I'm listening. And so I think this is that question. Those questions are really the really important. There was somebody who was in Changing Systems, Changing Ourselves, who said that they were offering sanctuary, and that this is a kind of example. They were offering sanctuary, and they were spending $40,000 on building a bathroom with a shower, and then they took Changing Systems, Changing Ourselves, and and that it changed them. They're like, wait a minute, why are we spending, this is our idea of how this should work. This isn't their idea. What do they need? What kind of shower do they need? And they shifted their resources, and the person said, I'm fine, just make it something simple, I'll be fine. And so they shifted from this opulent idea that they had to the simple thing that the person was being asked. So I think that it's a challenge, and nobody is saying that you need to stop listening to your inner voice, but that as you companion people and you quiet your mind and really listen to them and follow them, that you're going to shift, and the energy is going to shift, and the relationship is going to shift, and it's really it's a way to unlearn some of our socialization. In my experience, it is. Anybody have more to say? I have one more thing I want to just plant in your mind about this.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Mika.
I don't know how to make myself shown on this, but I'm on an iPad. I just wanted
You look
to say
great.
I can't see myself. One of the things I want to say is that I'm Latina, and in our culture, there's actually strength seen in somebody who can set aside their personal agenda and be of service. And so the more powerful is the one who can follow in some
Yeah.
cases,
Yeah.
and who
Yeah.
can accompany and who can be a companion. And so while the dominant society sometimes looks at these things as somebody who is weaker, for a lot of cultures, this is the strength of a person, is their
Yeah.
ability to set aside their ego and their personal agenda in order to be of service to others.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
so
Yeah.
this
Thank
is
you.
just, I know that you're talking from more of the dominant culture, but in some ways we have the opposite problem of how do we step into power, or how do we step
Mm,
into that, because that's not a valued thing in
mm,
some cases. So
mm. Well, and that reinforces the sense that it's important for people socially located to be leaders to support the voice of people who are not used to that position. Kristen says one can follow leaders, agenda, ideology, cultural ideas, being open to new ways of serving. Yeah, it's a totally different, it's kind of for me, it's a real paradigm shift to sort of do that. And Mika, when you were talking, I thought about um, like I have friends that are like in terms of resources, they're much more precarious than I am. And when they walk by somebody that's houseless, they give them money. And I also have seen the process where people of color are much in some ways much more generous, like and of service, because they know what it's like to need, and so they're more likely to give. And I think that process of really being willing um, to serve, as you say, is really important. The last image I want to leave for you is dancing, and this is one that's really important because it's not at all an inactive thing. It's not passive. When there is a leader in a dance and you're following them, you are very active. You are really engaged. You have to follow. You have to pay attention to their energy. You have to see where they're moving. In order to not step on each other's feet, you really have to like move with them, literally move with them. And I think that's a really powerful image for followership of really moving with somebody who, and you have to learn the way they dance. You have to learn that dance in order to be able to follow them. So you actually have to learn the steps. You have to be present and be willing to learn some things that you might not be accustomed to learning as well. So I'm just going to put dancing as a model for followership. Thank you very much. Is there anything anybody notices about these three things, or the connection between accompaniment, companionship, and followership? Any other insights that anyone wants to share before we move on? Great, thank you. And I think ultimately this is a spiritual discipline, and the reason that Quaker Social Change Ministry is set up, where there is a group that is practicing beloved community and transformative justice with one another and supporting each other and learning how to accompany, is because it's actually so, generally, it's non-normative in dominant culture. And so you actually need to do that, as well as having an embedded idea of what it feels like to be in right relationship with one another, and to really learn that, and then to go out and really be able to show up for the people that you're accompanying. Martha says followership is really hard for most of us. Yep, it is, and it takes intentionality, it takes some discipline, it takes kind of like just being present and showing up. I met today with Mary Watkins. I got to meet her in person, who is the author of Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons, which I talked about in the last webinar. It was really wonderful to meet her. And she was talking about when she moved to Santa Barbara, she didn't know anybody. And she found a group led by people who were undocumented. And she just showed up. She just went for a year and just was there and present. and they, you know, would do what they asked, but she was just really present. And then a project emerged where there was somebody who wanted to do oral histories of undocumented people. She saw that, you know, she might have some skills that would be useful, and there was a little group that worked together to do that. And I think that the patience of being present until people know you and will trust you and invite you to, you know, to use the gifts that you bring to support their work. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna move back.
Excuse me?
Yeah, is that Minga?
Yeah, no, this is Peg Nosa with the Houston Live Oak Friends meeting.
Hi, hi.
I think it's another perspective is to look at the balance of power and authority. So for accompaniment, the power is in the individual you're accompanying, and also the authority is with that person, or maybe shared with the person who's doing the accompaniment. Companionship, however, is where you give all the authority and all the power to the person who you're with. Now, for followership, it seems to be very different. It's where you give not just your presence, but also your total belief to the person you're following. In effect, you don't have the power or the authority. Just my thoughts. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to look at that.
I think that there's a real I think it's a little like again, like with dancing, it's active, and so, you know, you don't give up who you are in the process. And you know, the way that people follow Trump is really different from how we might follow you know, a person who was really interested in us retaining our sense of agency and stuff like that. So it's not I'm not sure that I completely understand you, but I think that they are very similar, and they're just a little bit, they're emphasizing something a little different. So with followership, you're, again, it's really important that we not replicate dominant systems in this process. So we're not trying to like make somebody else dominant over us. It's not about power over, but it is giving up some of our socially located power in order so that we can really hear and support the authority and the power of another. So Martha says followership is really hard for most of us. Maybe it is giving up our know-it-all and respecting a different kind of wisdom. Yes, excellent. It's not, and we'll talk about this more, it's not about fixing, it's not about showing up to tell people what to do and how and what solutions you have and you're bringing to the table. It's believing in people that are impacted to have those solutions and supporting them in enacting them and making them too. My partner talks about this as a really elemental, this is really about a pathway to reparations. This is about a pathway to shifting relationships so that we're restoring, you know, the land to people, the power to people who have not had it, that you're sort of releasing and relinquishing that so that things are more in balance. I think it's really about shifting so that power becomes more balanced and agency becomes more balanced. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. There'll be lots of chances to talk about this. So when we Minga, you sound like a little mouse. Go ahead and put in the chat. I don't know what's going on with your audio, and I wish Lem could fix it because I'd love to hear your voice. But if you want to add something in the chat, then we can. Not, yeah, then you can. Your voice can be heard at least. So, but if Lem, if you can help, that would be great. But
yeah, I chatted with Minga but didn't get a reply. Minga, I'm not sure if you can hear us. I guess you've been listening along and have been able to hear Lucy the whole time. We can see you on your webcam, and I just don't know what kind of a microphone you have, or what we are getting a very comical, cartoonish kind of a sound out of you right now.
go ahead and type
But
it.
just go ahead and type in. I think
Yeah.
that's probably the best right now.
Yeah, love to hear what you have to say. So we're going to do the next part of this workshop, which is we usually do in person. We were thinking of splitting into groups, but actually we're, because we're 29, I think it's fine to do this as a full group. So what we do in this next part is we, the people who created this model, Kelly Dignan and Kirsten Homblett, they interviewed some people that were really experienced in this practice of companioning or accompaniment, and they asked them like what was really important about it. And so there are these different scenarios that sort of say what's really important. And then I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to read these, and then I'm going to ask questions of you all in terms of how to practice this. And this, I really would love your, vibrant conversation. Feel free to turn your camera on and stuff like that. Minga says it's hard to describe an example in my search sanctuary work of 2 of the 3 approaches. We would love to hear. I would love to have your mic work. So hopefully you and Lem can still work on that and see if that will work. So this is the first scenario. There's 4 of them. We're going to go through as many as we can before 10. Stoughton Lind, who is a Quaker, in this picture, here he is with his wife Alice, are in their 80s and have spent years working in prisons, unions, the Black Freedom Movement, and for peace. He says that in all of his years of experience, accompaniment or companioning is the most effective way to do social change. Companioning, Stoughton says, is more than allies helping people oppressed by the systems and policies of society. Instead, it is 2 people exploring the way forward together. 2 people walking together in a loving, respectful, trusting relationship. He says companioning is a challenge for many of us because it requires we unlearn our patterns of dominance, our patterns of taking charge and getting things done. It insists that we learn to struggle together with someone. I love all of the stuff in this. I think it's really rich or nuanced. Anyway, so I'd like to ask 2 questions, and you can answer either one in the chat or just unmute yourself and turn your camera on. So the 2 questions are, what would it look like and feel like to do companioning in this way? And in this case, what would it mean and what would it take to unlearn patterns of dominance? And again, just dive in. And feel free to center and take a time to think about it. Anybody? I think that both of the questions I think are really vibrant questions and provocative ones. I think the one about unlearning our patterns of dominance, that one is really, really hard. One of the things that, and really important, one of the things that Mary Watkins talks about in this book is the edifying way shame shows up, that we make a mistake and we operate from our patterns of dominance and know it and having a sense of it and then reflect from the sense of unlearning that dominance. And I think that practice of making a mistake and then reflecting and changing behavior is a really important one. Jennifer says, I think it is humility and allowing space between thoughts and speaking or acting. Yes. And Margaret says it takes a commitment to self-control. Yeah. And for me, it's like a mindfulness practice, like to think before you speak, think before you act, like really, really slow yourself down a little bit in order to do that. Thank you. And other people have any thoughts? And again, if you want to turn on your camera, just jump in, or unmute yourself on the phone. To unmute yourself, it's *6. Um, Rob says, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, was really, really helpful to me in showing the way patterns of dominance are ingrained in so many aspects of my life. Yeah, her books are really great. She talks about just how we're so defensive around racism that defensiveness often can get in the way of us looking at ourselves and actually changing things, and shifting the way that we show up and be in the space. There are groups that I've been a part of that use different frameworks like white supremacy culture or others to examine the patterns that are emerging, because in order to unlearn patterns, you actually have to become really conscious of the patterns that exist, and take some discipline and intentionality. Sarah says, stop and check my initial reaction. Often it comes from a place of dominance. And I think that's really hard. It's hard to recognize how deep the socialization goes. I have a friend who talks about how neurologically, like trauma or these socialized patterns, they're in our nervous systems. They've become automatic responses, and so to learn a different automatic response takes mindfulness and consciousness and as you say, really stepping back and thinking before one acts. Other thoughts that people have about how one learns this practice and what would look like and feel like to show up this way? Again, feel free to raise your hand or just jump in.
I listened one time to are you hearing me?
Yeah, you're kind of soft, so if you want to speak up, that would be great.
I listened one time to it was Law for Black Lives Matter. And people gave their opinions on reparations. And one of the last people to speak was a woman who'd done kind of, I'd say more psychological kinds of things. And she talked about healing, how we all need to healing. The people who are oppressed and have been oppressed by we who are white, but both sides of us need to be healed, because when we recognize the privilege and the ingrained racism, there's tremendous shame and guilt sometimes, or often enough. And so how do we build healing into what we're doing on both sides, I guess? I mean, we can't impose what we have to do healing now. But
right. Yeah.
How can we work at that? I mean, she was a Black woman who'd done, I'm trying to think about what that's called. Like, it's kind of well, very psychological, more than activism kind of stuff. Talking about that, how do we heal one another? And I'm part of a racism group, and sometimes if people, we're all white except for one person who's Black person. When we correct people, sometimes we harm them. They need to hear, but we're wounding also. So maybe in our groups, how do we help raise our consciousness and heal one another in the process? That's a really big deal. And to me, the leadership would have to come from the group that's oppressed. But even to suggest that, to say, how do we do this? How do we heal? Not only work on the problems, but how do we heal one another so that our society doesn't get worse?
Right. Right. And I think it's really, really important. And that's, I mean, this is why there's a kind of the social change group is, often more often privileged or socially located in a more privileged position to work with each other, to hold one another accountable, to invite one another into deeper healing, but to do that healing work together and not in accountable ways to people of color, that you're really trying to change and shift their material conditions, the way they experience the world, in pragmatic and in spiritual ways, but you're doing it following their lead, and you have to do your healing work together in order to show up for them well. And that's how this is structured. It's really about like healing the way that white people have learned disconnection, healing the way that we have learned to walk by people who are oppressed and not have our hearts broken by that, and feel like we are connected to them and to that oppression. So I think that there's huge amount of healing, yeah, and that this process, one of the things I really love about this model is that you're embedding the healing work, and there's lots of resources on trauma healing. There's a really wonderful resource called My Grandmother's Hands, by Resma Menachem. It's on my table right here, on my coffee table. It's about trauma healing from racism, and he has these very deep exercises that you can do, and he talks about healing from racism as a person of color. He talks about healing from racism as a white person, and really intentionally walking through this process together. So that's a really important resource that people can use as you're working in the small group that you're doing together. But the thing I love is that there's embedded, the healing is happening, that you have a group to do that with, and then you have action that you are trying to accompany. You're trying to actually shift the material conditions and walk with people who are trying to change and become liberated. And so the reason I like this is it's like action research, that you actually try the companioning and then you come back and you heal. And so you're not healing, spending decades healing before you try to do something. And so I think that's one of the things I really love about this model. Kristen says, when a Black man was killed by police in Martinsburg, I worked with the leadership of the NAACP to take direct action. Sometimes I was unsure about taking such strong actions, and they were unsure of me at first, but really needed my computer skills. I think we accomplished some good things over about 2 years. One problem for me was that others in the NAACP were terribly frightened of retaliation, but the leadership took strong actions. Sometimes this was confusing for me. It was very intense. 2 years was about all I could handle. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's that's a really important piece, is that if you get closer to people who are oppressed, you're going to get closer to oppression. You're going to get closer to the experience of that, and the tension of people having differences of opinion about how to move forward as well. And I think that, like, being present enough so that you can be in those conversations and have those relationships is really important. Thank you for sharing that story. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next scenario? Here is Vincent Harding. I got to interview him several years ago. He's such a lovely person. It looks like somebody's trying to speak that's on the phone. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Go
This
ahead.
is David.
Hi, David.
Hello, greetings. You said earlier that we cannot unlearn something that we're not conscious of. And in my experience, in order to become conscious of things, I've sometimes had to be called on them and then be able to listen and not get too defensive, and to acknowledge that, in fact, I did do something that showed I was unconscious, acting out of power or privilege. So I think it's really important to develop relationships with those whom we are companioning, or accompanying or following, that allow them to call us when we are in some way acting unconsciously.
Audio right now.
Were you able
Len,
to
can
hear
you
that?
help? Can you hear me?
I hear you beautifully.
Lucy, I could hear David. Are you hearing me?
I hear you great.
Okay. Lucy seems to have lost her audio. Let me chat with her real quick.
I figured it out. David, did you finish?
I did finish. I don't
Okay,
know
great. I heard the beginning part. I'd love to hear the ending part.
Okay, my point was that in order for me to become conscious of ways in which I am not acting in way inconsistent with accompanying or following, I may need to be called on something.
Yeah.
So that the person whom I am accompanying or following, I hope to be in a relationship of trust that allows that person to say, David, you're out of line, or this is what you've done. This is the impact you've had on me. I may not be conscious enough at all moments to know.
And
So
I think, yeah, I think that's really important. And I think being willing to be challenged is important. I also think that being willing to grow in our capacity as white folks, as people of privilege, to call each other out, and to notice internally over time. I think it's a dynamic of all of those things. And you know, a lot of people of color, like, they want us as white folks to do the work so that they don't have to be calling us out all the time. And I think that the main thing that I've seen is that if somebody calls you out for something and you learn to alter your behavior one time, then I think that that the person who's done that feels like, okay, this person is worth doing that with. But if you make the same mistake over and over again, then it's much harder. So I think that that's another piece, and that's again where we can support each other in our growth and our learning.
agreed.
Yeah.
How do I unmute? How do I mute myself again?
You do *6. Thanks for chiming in. So I got to meet, this is Vincent Harding, who died several years ago, and who's an amazing person, who is you all, I'm sure, know that he was a companion of Martin Luther King's confidant, and he actually, the wonderful Beyond Vietnam speech he wrote, and when I talked to him about that, he said, Martin and I were of such a same mind that it wasn't my speech, it was our speech, and it wasn't me writing, it was us writing it. We knew each other so well. Just a really amazing person who, when I walked into the room to meet him, just has this had an incredible open spirit. Anyway, that's enough about Vincent. He's a really amazing person. So Dr. Vincent Harding was an historian, a social activist, and a speechwriter and a confidant of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He recalls a Mississippi summer of 1964. It was important then, he says, for the volunteers who were coming from the North to realize that they were coming with a very real burden of white class and academic superiority. They were coming to the Black community of Mississippi, which was by and large working class. They had to find out how to recognize what they were bringing with them, which was an attitude of how much they'd be able to offer and give and do, and then they had to find a way to transpose that into a spirit of coming and giving thanks for the gift they were going to receive. Dr. Harding says the fundamental model for the social change work we all do together now looks like listening more than speaking, partnering instead of helping, people holding on to and being held by people, singing together, being absolutely befuddled together. All of these actions are what grows out of us simply being on the path together, walking hand in hand. Just love that. So the questions for this one are, what would it look like and feel like to do social justice in this way? And what gift will you be receiving as you companion? And again, anybody feel free to chime in. And you can chime in on the chat, or you can chime in by speaking. Love to hear from you. Like, what would it mean to do that? I love the thing about struggling with one another in here. I think it's really wonderful. And the singing together. The last part is just really great. Come on. I'm sure you have insights. Love to hear you.
David again.
Go ahead.
I have been a companion to Cambodian refugees and have learned so much from them about resilience and perseverance, and also about their culture. A great gift of their dance and music brought to my community in New Hampshire. And I definitely feel I received more from them than I gave.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think thank you. And I think the folks that I mean, I've done this a number of times in different ways, and this the sense of a growing sense of belonging and connection is one of the really big gifts that I've gotten from this practice, and from being able to be present with another or a group of people that are trying to do work, and I think that that's a really a powerful gift. Any other thoughts on what it would look like or feel like to do social change in this particular way, based on what Vincent Harding's words? Anything coming up for you, sorry. Any more thoughts about the gifts that you would receive?
I can say something.
Go ahead, please.
So I'm having a little bit of difficulty answering this because I think I bridge the worlds.
Yeah, sure.
But I'll say for my own community that we are resilient. There's a resiliency, and that there is a deep wisdom about interconnection and things. And it's, I feel like at the time that we're in right now, that the wisdom and the knowledge is really needed in order to address the issues, especially with climate change and things that are just perpetuated by a selfishness in my
Yes.
mind that isn't native to our culture. And so I appreciate this, that, this idea of listening and learning, but I feel like we're adaptable. And the other thing I would say is we laugh a lot more. And there's a lot more, I don't know, music and dance, and there's just much more all of that. And as somebody who has lived mostly in the dominant white culture and has bridged that gap, it's interesting to me to think about this question. Is weird because I'm coming at it from the other direction and trying to look at it backwards, and I'm not sure how to answer it, but I do feel that it's time to listen to people of color. I just think it's time, and I think I appreciate any effort that's made to do that. So
yeah, thank you. And I think like what you say about, I mean, I think white culture is really bad at community overall, really not good at it. And I think that this is a way to learn it. And I mean, there may be exceptions to that. There can be little pockets of, folks who are, have a real deep connection with one another. But I think like what you say about dancing or singing together and being, laughing, like just laughing together, like there's just a different, and I don't want to like exoticize this at all. It's just when you understand that your survival is dependent on being connected with other people, you have a very different sense of the world. And that, and like what you said about resilience, one of the things that I think has been a result of this for me, practicing this, is my resilience is growing. My capacity to hear about pain, to receive it, to hold it, to not make it about me, and to really like be present for somebody has grown quite a bit. The other thing is, my partner was telling me something that I thought was really interesting, is that when I am on the street and I interact with people just on the street, you know, they sell books on the street, and so I sit sometimes with them, and being able to just make a connection and not have this sort of, I used to have a sense of just like, there was this propriety that would keep me from being able to just make a simple connection, whether that was in a store or somewhere else. That is a huge gift of being able to walk around and understand that you can make a connection with anybody that you see. That's an enormous gift. And that comes from this accompaniment to me. Thank you. Thank you, Mika. Anybody else have something they'd like to share? Okay. All right. I'm watching the time. Yeah, we're going to move on. So we have two more scenarios, and I actually want to read the last one, but we're not going to, maybe we'll have just a little time to talk about it, but I think that we'll skip to this one. This is a photograph of Lisa Marie Alvarado, who's our staff in Miami, really wonderful, and some of the students she works with. She's an immigrant herself and works with undocumented folks and for immigrant rights. So this one is like a direct thing. Oh, Mila said, it feels like being with instead of doing for, profoundly relational community. It's a reconnecting to our humanity and not on the we're all one race discourse. Right, exactly. It's profoundly relational. It's about restoring these relationships on the way to restoring the earth and restoring equitable resource allocation and all of these other things that I think are foundationally about relationship. Thanks, Mila, I appreciate that. So this one is, two social justice activists who are undocumented immigrants say what they want from their solidarity partners. Don't take over when we're trying to get something done. Don't act out of control at a rally. Be someone we can trust. Be somebody who wants to get to know us. We want to be viewed as experts, and we need the help of partners to get access to decision makers and do some of the work like fundraising, donating, sorry, this is behind my thing, and rallying their people. The most important thing is to be in it for the long haul and be our friends. We'll take a moment to talk about this because I think this is a really important and good one. So the questions for this was, what would it look like and feel like to do social justice in this way? And what would it mean, and what would to be in it for the long haul? Again, just unmute or put something in the chat. I love this one because it's so direct. It's like, this is what we need. Show up for us. Any other thoughts about this one? Yeah, David, go ahead.
As a community organizer many years ago in Kentucky, I was eager to get stuff done. I had to learn to slow down. People wanted to know me, to get to trust me before they would do stuff with me. Yeah. That meant, this reminds me of what someone else said about eating bad canned food. I don't know how many cups of very bad coffee I had sitting on people's porches. Just being there, spending time with them, hanging out was so important. Once that was done and some friendships developed, then other things followed.
Yeah, yes, that's really important. It's so, and that act is very simple, but it's very powerful and profound. I had the privilege of going to Jackson, Mississippi in the winter, I think in February, and met this woman, Nia Umoja, who with her partner came to Jackson after having a intentional community get destroyed and actually taken over by eminent domain in Fort Worth. She came to Jackson to be a part of a movement, and she was out from outside of the community. They got a house for, houses are very cheap, and she got a house very, very cheap. And the way that she started was by sitting on people's porches. Like, the relationships were core, they're the fuel for the rest of what they did. Now they have a huge community garden, and they have 60 people come to their community meetings where they make decisions as a collective. They're expanding. But it all started with that, sitting on the porches and really talking with each other. All right, we're going to move on. Feel free to raise your hand or say something. I am going to read this, I think, because I think it's simpler, unless somebody else wants to read it. If anybody else wants to read it, just raise your hand. We can read it together. I'll read it and you read it with me. So the tenets of accompanying for social change. So out of this advice that was given, these tenets were established that I think are just really powerful and really profound and deeply important. So the tenets for accompanying for social change are building relationships of trust and accountability with people and communities most impacted by injustice by showing up and staying in the relationships for the long haul. 2, remembering that the liberation of everyone and everything is inherently connected, and together we are on a learning journey toward it. 3, walking together while navigating differences in a loving, respectful, trusting relationship. 4, struggling together and encouraging one another's spiritual growth. 5, contemplating the gifts you are going to receive when accompanying, sorry about that, instead of how you will give, help, teach, tell, or fix. Acknowledging and unlearning your patterns of dominance, like taking charge, leading, making decisions, etc. Asking for and lending empathic support. Moving beyond asking to acting. Getting out, this is really important, getting out of your comfort zone materially, emotionally, and physically, and allowing yourself to be changed by this process. And then the last one, number 10, sorry, I'm going to move this over. So disrupting the systems and structures of oppression with integrity and an authentic community with those most impacted following their leadership. And one of the things I love about these tenets is that it moves from the ground to the system. Instead of, so often, if you're socially located as more privileged, you think, well, let's go fix the stuff at the top first. But this begins with the relationship and the ground, and then moves towards disrupting the systems out of those relationships, out of reweaving those connections. And I think that's a really powerful and really important and critical difference. Anybody have any thoughts about this or questions about this? Jump in, and love to hear them. I love this. I think this is like a really great framework. So that is, I'm going to read this and then I'll open it up for any questions or thoughts that you have at the end, and then we'll close. This is a quote that's in the Quaker Social Change Ministry Manual that I really love. To live into an anti-racist identity through commitment to solidarity with peoples of color, white individuals and predominantly white communities do better to listen to communities of color long enough to discern the interests of those communities, then working to understand how those interests are held in common with one's own community, and committing energies to working for those interests in mutuality. As noted above, the formation of relationships with sufficient trust to enable this collaboration requires time and evidence of followership. It also requires and helps to develop accountability and mutuality. So I'd love to, we're getting close to our time, but we have about 5 or 6 more minutes. If you have any other thoughts or stories that you'd like to share, I'd really love to hear them and have you share with each other. And put it in the chat or just talk. That either one is great. You all were chattier last week. Love to hear if you have anything else to share or anything thoughts, especially from those people who have not spoken or shared very much. Love to hear your thoughts about any of this, anything that was presented. One thing that I will say is that this is very, very simple, really simple, but it's really hard to learn and it's really hard to embody, and that we need each other to learn how to do it. And yeah, and like if you all have any questions about like resources or anything like that, I'd be happy to hear those. While anybody's, again, feel free to just jump in, but I'm also going to show you again the Quaker Social Change Ministry page, which is where you can find all of the resources in the manual. But I'd love to hear you're all so quiet tonight. So here is where all these resources are. If you go to afsc.org/QSCM, you're going to see last week's webinar. This week's webinar will be added. A 90-minute version about QSCM is here. The manual's here, all the things that you really need, some blog posts about the process. Kristen says, I moved to Appalachia because I saw West Virginia as one of the most depressed in the U.S. with socioeconomic indicators the lowest in the nation. Looking over these ideas about a company, I think there may be differences in different groups. I'm not sure what might be different yet, but I think different culture groups may need different kinds of accompaniment. Yes, yes, and I think that in order to learn, I think you're talking about, I think that the group itself, the individuals that you want to support are the greatest teachers of that, I believe. But I think that's a really important insight, that you can't, there's not a cookie cutter version of accompaniment. The principles can hold, but there's not a cookie cutter. It's done in relationship, and you have to learn those people, learn from the people that you're trying to accompany first. Any other thoughts or things that people want to share before we finish? Nika says, thank you. I have to go to another meeting. Enjoy your meeting. This was very interesting. Any other thoughts? You all can, Lem, if you want to unmute people, we will close with a moment of centering worship. And then any of you want to be in touch with me, you can write to me at lduncan@afsc.org. I'll send you anything more. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to support you however you need. Again, we're going to have a Changing Systems, Changing Ourselves e-course begin. It'll be the 4th Tuesday of every month beginning in January for 5 months through May. Love to have you join us in that and form a group that would join us in that as well. Great, so let's close with some worship. Lovely to have been with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining, and be in touch if you have any questions.